Afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, the third in our Ask an Expert series on acoustics in planning. My name is Mark McFadden. I'm a senior planner at the CBRE Birmingham office and part of the West Midlands Young Planners Committee. As I said, this is the third in our series. We've previously done two webinars, one on ground conditions, another on viability and planning. And today we're currently joined by Bob Albon, who's associate partner at Sandy Brown Associates, who's going to take us through a whistle-stop tour of acoustic considerations in planning, then drilling down to a bit more of a focus on the key things for you to think about when you're looking at sites in our town and city centres. And obviously the regeneration of our town and city centres is a really hot topic at the moment, always is, but ever more so with what is going on with the high street. But presents us with kind of a raft of considerations when we're thinking about bringing more residential into areas or bringing other mixed uses in where that hasn't been before. Just a couple of housekeeping bits before we kick off. You'll all have joined the webinar muted. Please stay muted. Please feel free to ask questions. There's a chat function, I believe, that should appear on the right-hand side of your screen where you can fire all of your burning noise-related questions to Bob. During the course of Bob's presentation, I'll be going through so that we've got these ready for after the presentation. Hopefully we'll get through a lot of them, but obviously I think we've got about 100 people registered today, so we might not have time for all of them. The final point is that this session has been recorded, and so that means that you'll be able to get a link to this presentation as well as the actual presentation slides that Bob will show shortly. So without further ado, Bob, if you'd like to kick off.
Okay, thank you, Mark. So as Mark said, my name is Bob Albon. I'm an associate partner with Sandy Brown Associates. We are the largest independent acoustic consultancy in the UK, and we specialise in building acoustics. So we work on lots of different sorts of buildings, from offices to TV studios to concert halls, and as part of that we get involved in the planning process. Sometimes it's a standalone exercise, but often as part of the overall design of a building. So I'm going to just talk a bit about acoustics and building acoustics, and how the sort of relevant considerations for planning. I'm going to focus particularly on residential developments and entertainment noise impact, and then I've got a sort of short case study that I'm going to go through at the end, which looks at a project in the Jewellery Quarter in Birmingham that I was involved in. The proposals for that were essentially it's an office building that was being converted under general permit development order to residential use. I was working for the pub next door, which is called 1000 Trades. Some of you may know it, and they were objecting to the prior approval application. Initially, just some definitions just to think about what acoustics and planning mean. So the most common thing that people think of with acoustics is sort of room acoustics and how a room sounds when you're in it. So this is more relevant to your concert hall. Generally, in terms of acoustics and planning, we're thinking more about it's the science of sound. It's the branch of physics concerned with the properties of sound, as is defined here. For planning, I'm sure you will know a great deal more about planning than I do. Obviously, in this context, the second definition on the slide here, the control of urban development by the local authority. But the sort of the more basic definition of the design, the forethought, and it's about thinking about how things are going to work in practice. Because we're talking about entertainment noise, the main source of entertainment noise is probably music. The secondary source is the patrons of the entertainment venue. So their music is something that people enjoy listening to. Sometimes we don't enjoy listening to other people's music. There's an issue of taste there, but arguably by the time music has filtered through a wall or a window, you've lost a lot of the desirable qualities of it, and it turns into noise. Some people will say that one person's music is another person's noise, whatever it is. But the difference between music and noise is a sort of, it's subjective, and this is true of a lot of different sounds. So people's reaction to sound is complex, and it depends on sort of psychological aspects, but also it depends on the characteristics of the sound. Because we're thinking about music, a particular consideration is the concept of frequency. So for simplicity, normally when we talk about sound, we might say it is 50 dBA or 70 dBA, and so that gives us an idea of the level. The A term refers to an A weighting, which tries to reflect the response of the human ear to sound. So notionally, these numbers become comparable. But even so, people will respond differently to different sounds that are the same level in terms of dBA. I might be showing my age here, but one obvious, to me at least, examples of this is someone dragging their nails down a blackboard at school and the sort of hairs on the back of your neck standing up and people wincing. And so this clearly provokes a much stronger reaction than a more bland noise. As we're thinking about entertainment noise, it's worth considering this. So in acoustics, we describe frequency as low, mid, and high frequency. In music, low frequency would be called bass, and high frequency would be called treble. Because of the bass element of music, it can be particularly disturbing. Bass and low frequencies are harder to control than other sounds and require more substantial mitigation. The other aspects of music are that it varies in level, so it catches your attention through that way, and also it's inherently, ideally, catchy and wants to make you listen to it. So this image gives a summary of the sort of acoustic considerations for a normal building. Some of these are more relevant to planning than others. Most obviously, planning tends to consider, there's two obvious distinctions to making planning. If you're trying to build a building, you want to get planning permission for it, there is the impact of your building on the surrounding environment, and then there is the impact of the surrounding environment on your building. Most local authorities will have requirements for you controlling the noise from plant and machinery, your sort of mechanical services equipment shown on the roof of the building in this picture, and that would apply regardless of the building type. For noise sensitive buildings, specifically residential buildings, then it starts to become appropriate to assess the suitability of the site for the proposed use, at which point you start having to consider the noise impact on your building. Now, in a city centre location, you have transportation noise sources. We've got cars, trains, aircraft shown on this slide. You've also got neighbours shown on this side. So in that sort of context, this is more likely to be your commercial neighbours. So this could be a factory manufacturing stuff and making noise that way, or it could be an entertainment venue, as I'm going to sort of come on to focus on. Noise used to be covered by Planning Policy Guidance Note 24, PPG 24, which set out levels at which were considered appropriate for developing sites. This was all replaced by the NPPF, and I'm most familiar with the sections that relate to noise, but noise is required to be considered under the NPPF as part of their sort of health and quality of life impacts, and local authorities generally require assessments in accordance with this. What the NPPF doesn't provide is any kind of numerical criteria to tell you what it is that you need to achieve. Another important aspect of the NPPF is in the February 2019 revision, they introduced the concept of the agent of change. So this says that if you want to develop in a location, it's your responsibility to incorporate mitigation into your development so that you control the impact of existing businesses on your development. So in the context of an entertainment assessment, you're putting residential next to a nightclub. The nightclub should be protected from having complaints by the future residents. So you need to consider this and demonstrate that you've mitigated against this as part of your development. So that it also talks about future expansion, which is a bit tricky to get your head around. It's more easy to quantify what they're doing at the moment and try and demonstrate that that will work with the completed development. So for a general planning assessment, you would consider a variety of noise sources, including your transportation noise sources. Under a general permitted development order and prior approval process, which has recently been extended by the government, this allows a change of use from various commercial uses to a residential use without a full planning assessment. Originally, there was no requirement for any assessment of noise impact under this. In 2016, it was amended to allow the local planning authority to require prior approval for noise impact from surrounding commercial uses. Quite what constitutes a commercial use isn't very well defined. Some are fairly obvious. Your factory that's making lots of noise, that's clearly a commercial use. Arguably, deliveries to a business are associated with the commercial use. Is a customer turning up in a car to a building a commercial noise source? Arguably not. Maybe it is. If it is, when does that occur? Does it occur when they get into the car park or not? So there are some grey areas around this, but entertainment noise from a venue is clearly a fairly obvious commercial use. So to assess the noise impact to satisfy the requirements of NPPF and the General Permit Development Order, we need to consider the impact of the noise sources on our proposed residential development. So to do this, we need to quantify what the noise sources are. Now, this is generally done through a noise survey. So you would set out to go to the site, measure the noise levels and see what they are. The noise survey needs to be representative of the typical and reasonable worst case impacts that will affect the site. This is a lot easier to achieve with transportation noise sources than entertainment noise. Sort of road traffic tends to be fairly consistent from one day to the next, at least during the week, and from 1 week to the next. Entertainment noise is more difficult, it's more challenging to quantify. A venue that is licensed to have live music might have different types of music on at different times of the year, depending on who's touring at that point. They may also be licensed to operate later than they actually do. So they may have a license to operate till 3 a.m., 4 a.m., but they're only currently operating until 12. So this can restrict your ability to gain representative data somewhat, at which point you start having to make reference to library noise levels and doing predictions, which is necessary, but perhaps a bit more, adds a bit of uncertainty to it. Once we know what noise levels affect a site, we need to decide what we're trying to achieve inside the development, what an acceptable internal noise level is. And now what that number is, or what you're trying to achieve, depends on the source, depends on the characteristics of the source. BSA 233 is the sort of standard reference document for most planning applications for residential developments. It gives suitable internal noise levels for residential premises. It also considers external amenity areas, gardens and the like, which some local authorities will condition. It's based on guidance provided by the World Health Organization, and it is based on reasonable communication conditions and resting conditions during the day and allowing sleep at night. But it considers typical noise sources, anonymous noise sources like transportation sources, rather than entertainment noise, where it falls down somewhat. So BSA 233 says that during the day, which is, you want to get 35 dBA inside, and during the night you try and get 30 dBA inside. These are defined in terms of the LAEQ, which is part of the alphabet soup that unfortunately comes with acoustics. But what you can consider this to be is essentially an average level. So if the energy across the whole of the day was averaged out, you need to get 35 dBA. At night to sleep, you need lower noise levels, and the duration is shorter, so that's an 8-hour time period, so that reduces the limit down to 30. However, it does caveat this. These numbers apply to noise levels without specific character, and it defines specific character as containing tones, being irregular, or having a strong low frequency content, your sort of base of the music. So arguably, all of these aspects are present in music or entertainment noise. Something which is important to note, both for general assessments and also entertainment assessments, is that it states that if you're relying on closed windows to meet the guide values, there needs to be an appropriate method of ventilation that doesn't compromise the facade performance. So if you've got your window open, clearly putting a high specification window on it isn't going to do anything to control your internal noise levels. Quite what you use for the criteria for entertainment noise sources is a subject of some debate. It is much less well defined and there's less consensus on it. In an ideal world, you would just determine that the music noise was totally inaudible, and therefore it would have no impact. In practice, that can be very hard to achieve, and defining what inaudibility is can be challenging in itself. So I'm going to look in a little, so as an example, I'm going to look at the Good Practice Guide, which is published by the Institute of Acoustics. So the Institute of Acoustics is much like the RTPI, except for acoustic consultants. So a reputable acoustic consultant will be a member of the IOA, and they promote acoustics to the wider public and have a code of ethics which we abide by. So they, some time ago, 1996, they formed a working group to try and develop a code of practice, which would set out what you needed to achieve to control entertainment noise to a suitable level. It had various stakeholders, including representatives from the pub and club industry. Unfortunately, it all fell apart somewhat. Agreeing this was all evidently fairly contentious, and the industry representatives withdrew from the working group. So they ended up publishing a Good Practice Guide in March 2003. It lacks somewhat in detail. It doesn't have any numerical criteria proposed in it, although they did draft there's a working annex that was provided and proposed, but it wasn't adopted. However, they did subsequently publish the criteria in an IOA bulletin at the end of 2003. John Hinton, who was an EHO at Birmingham City Council at the time, was involved in the working group, I understand, and Birmingham City Council specifically refer to this guide in their planning requirements for assessment of entertainment noise, which is why I'm looking at this in particular. Other local authorities have other requirements trying to achieve the same sort of thing. Manchester have their own requirements, which is based on more recent research that was done at the University of Salford, and they take a slightly different approach. So the IOA say that they give different criteria depending on the frequency, in terms of how often it occurs and the timing of the events. For something that happens less than 30 times a year and less than once a week and finishes before 11 p.m, they require that the LAEQ, so that's your sort of average noise level, is less than or equal to the background noise level plus 5 dB. So LA90, more alphabet soup, is the background noise level. So that is, you can think of that as the noise level when nothing is happening. So in the middle of the night, when there's nothing going on, it never really gets quiet. The noise levels just drop to low level. So it's the noise level that you hear in between noise events. And so that is the simple criterion for that condition. And then they get increasingly more onerous as the frequency and timing changes. So for events that happen more than 30 times a year and still less than once a week and still finishing before 11 p.m, there's a second requirement that is added, and that starts to consider the frequency contents of the entertainment noise, the music. So this is to control the bass beat, the thud that you hear emanating from a boy racer's car or breaking through the wall from your neighbours when they're having a party. So this criterion, it requires the L10. So this is the level exceeded 10% of the time to be no more than 5 dB above the background noise level, but in 1/3 octave bands. So if we go back to this slide, you can see down here, you've got this bass band, which is defined on here as 40 to 160 hertz. So it's specifically trying to control the low frequency noise from the music. And in practice, if you control the low frequency noise, because it's the most hard noise to control, you will inherently control the high frequency noise. Then for something which is much more likely that you're going to need to consider in an urban environment, if you're near an actual venue, is something happening more than once a week or finishing after 11 p.m. There, the criterion is more onerous. It is the average noise level to be no greater than the background noise level, and the L10, the level exceeded 10% of the time, to be no higher than the background noise level in any of these 1/3 octave bands, these low frequency bands. Now, the intent of these is that the second criterion, where they first introduced the frequency control, is that it would be generally audible but not overly intrusive. But then for events that go on past 11 p.m, the idea is that these would be controlled to be virtually inaudible if you achieve this second low frequency criterion. And in practice, the criterion 2, as I've labeled it here, is always going to be the more onerous requirement. Now, these criteria they can be applied outside or inside your noise sensitive premises. So generally, you would tend to consider them inside, because that way you can consider the benefit of mitigation in terms of what you can do to the exterior of the building. So once we know what the noise levels affecting the site are and what we're trying to achieve inside the site, we can do calculations and assess whether we're going to achieve the criteria, and if not, whether we can achieve the criteria, because that is an important consideration, and what we might need to do, or what we do need to do, to consider the criterion. If our source is in a separate building, the neighbours on this drawing, and our entertainment noise is breaking out from that, we're concerned with the facade and the building envelope of our building, and so we need to look at noise coming in through the windows, through the solid elements of the facade, and through the ventilation paths. So traditionally, you achieve ventilation by opening your windows. Clearly, that's going to be a problem if your site is subject to entertainment noise. If your entertainment venue is within your building, perhaps as part of a mixed-use development, or structurally attached to your building, it's the building next door, then you need to start considering internal noise transfer as well. So noise breaking through the separating wall or the separating floors, or just getting into the building and traveling across. Now, it's an important aspect of all this is there is a limit to what you can achieve. You can't just specify higher and higher levels of sound insulation. And with the music noise source, and the ability to have amplifiers, live music, drum kits, nightclubs, very high levels of music noise. There's a limit to what you can do. You can get into very specialist constructions like floating structures, but there are practical limitations on what you can do. So what you can do is you can start enhancing your facade specification. You specify very wide airspace glazing, which would be necessary to achieve the low frequency losses that you need. You can start reducing the size of your windows to control the weaknesses that they introduce. Windows would generally be weaker than the solid elements of the facade. You can start to provide mechanical ventilation, so you don't need to open your windows, you don't have any passive ventilation openings in your facade. If you are structurally connected to the building next door, the source of the entertainment noise, you can start looking at enhanced separating wall and floor constructions. In an extreme circumstance, you can start to look at structural isolation. So physically breaking the structural connections between your building and the building next door, either by building floating boxes that sit on springs within your building, or physically introducing a cut between your building and the next one. Clearly, these are fairly major interventions and have cost implications, as well as practical implications in terms of the amount of space that they will take up. So the reality of providing mitigation is a very important consideration. It's important that everyone is realistic about this. The local authority need to understand what is achievable. The assessor who is looking at it needs to understand what is achievable as well. It can be tempting to consider planning as a sort of individual event, and all you're trying to do is achieve planning permission. But at the end of the day, someone has to build this. With such a contentious thing, it will likely be conditioned, so you'll need to demonstrate that it works at the end of the day, and that can be no mean feat. So with that in mind, I'm going to look at a specific project that I got involved in. So this is, on the right hand side here, you can see 1000 Trades, which is a pub and live music venue in the Jewellery Quarter in Birmingham. On the left hand side is Albion Court. It's an office building which was proposed to be converted into a residential development under permitted development routes, and it needed prior approval to assess the impact of the commercial noise from the operation of 1000 Trades. So you can see they're structurally connected. There is a party wall between the two buildings here. 1000 Trades they have a DJ on the ground floor, and on the first floor here behind these windows they have live music events. They're licensed to operate until 3 AM. Also notable that you've got some sash windows here. So these are old traditional sashes. None of these are going to be very good at controlling noise breaking out in terms of 1000 Trades, or breaking in terms of Albion Court. Over our left hand shoulder, as we look at this, there's another venue called Acapella, which is also a live music venue, and it's also licensed to operate until 3 AM. So an application was submitted for prior approval to do this. I was employed by 1000 Trades to provide a fairly light touch commentary on the noise assessment that was submitted with the application. The applicant had proposed mitigation in the form of secondary glazing to the existing windows there, mechanical ventilation, so they didn't need to open the windows, and there was no passive ventilation opening in the facade, and also in the form of enhancements to the party wall between the buildings. They had adopted, so they proposed this mitigation to achieve an internal noise limit of NR 25. Now, I haven't gone into what NR means, but it provides very low levels of low frequency noise control, which is the main consideration for entertainment noise. And so that was my main comment on 1000 Trades' behalf on the application. Now, this had notionally been agreed with Birmingham City Council, which was odd because it was not it wasn't consistent with their typical requirements for entertainment noise, and ultimately the application was rejected by Birmingham City Council on the basis that the development would provide unsuitable living conditions because the windows would have to be sealed shut to control noise ingress. They didn't get into any of the issues surrounding the criterion. So from there, the developer then appealed the decision to the planning inspectorate. They argued that living conditions were not a consideration under a general permitted development order, and therefore the grounds, Birmingham City Council's grounds for rejecting it were incorrect. So it went to a planning hearing. I was again employed by 1000 Trades, this time to do a more detailed assessment of the noise assessment that was submitted as part of the original application, and also to deal with evidence that was submitted by the developer to address some of my comments on the original application. And I was also attended the planning hearing as a third party, as an expert witness on behalf of Alden Court Action Group 1000 Trades, who were third party objectors. Ultimately, the appeal was dismissed. The planning inspector found that while the general permit development order didn't explicitly consider living conditions, it was implicit in the need to consider the assessment of the noise impact, and ultimately, as was confirmed by the applicant, the appellant, in the hearing, that for the mitigation to work, it relied on the residents to keep their windows closed. So the secondary glazing that they proposed had to remain shut in order for the internal noise level to be acceptable. It was considered that you couldn't ensure that people would do this. They may open their windows, and therefore they would be impacted by the entertainment noise from 1000 Trades. And on this basis, it was dismissed. And certainly the council, who appeared on behalf of Alden Court Action Group, was of the opinion that this was quite a significant decision, and he's finding that the manner in which it was to propose to mitigate the noise was an integral and non-severable part of assessing the impact on the conditions. So I don't know if this sets some kind of precedent for the future, but it was very interesting process to be involved in. So, not to go on too much, it's important that we consider the impacts on new noise sensitive premises as part of the planning process. In a general planning application, you would consider noise from all sources, but under a general permit development order, the scope of the assessment is listened to commercial noise sources, which is interesting and adds some complexity. There's a bit of a contradiction there. The requirements for controlling entertainment noise are more onerous and more complex than for assessing anonymous noise sources. I mean, this is necessary and appropriate. And to have a successful outcome, you need to do a detailed assessment, you need to set appropriate criteria, and you need to be mindful of being challenged further down the line. The approach that I tend to take is I assume that someone is going to try and take my work apart at the end of the day, and that way you can make it robust. Thank you, and I will take any questions now.
Brilliant, thanks for that, Bob. That was definitely a whistle-stop tour, and obviously, you know, this is, you used a Birmingham-based example, but I've just seen that a lot of you have logged in, have come from all over the country. I'm sure there'll be some lessons in there that you can apply to, you know, pubs and clubs near you. One of the questions we received, this is a bit of a methodology point. So someone's asked, do you think that the Salford uni approach, which you made reference to acoustics, do you think that that could be the way forward for other cities to adopt in order to recognise you know, the role of having a healthy music and nightlife scene?
Yes, I think it is. So they unlike the IOA good practice guide, they've set some absolute limits in terms of noise levels there, and they say that if the low frequency noise is below X dB, 47 at 63 hertz, I think from memory, then it will be an acceptable impact. I think it makes sense. So what I didn't get into, one of the issues with the Birmingham City Council working Institute of Acoustics approach is that you need to define what this background noise level is in the space, and how can you know what the background noise level is going to be in a building that isn't yet built. So you have to start making assumptions there, and you are very much in the realms of what is actually audible in terms of low frequencies. So we worked on another project in Birmingham recently. It was a hotel rather than residential development, but we've referred to this Salford guidance in that, so I think it is sensible. There is a working group working for the IOA at the moment, working on a new entertainment noise assessment methodology. It's been going on for years, though. I understand they're getting close to publishing something, so hopefully something will come along.
Great, that's a good starting point then. So I mean, well, I guess if we go back to the MPPF and the fact that, you know, the agent of change kind of came around in the national guidance, which people, you know, really saw as quite a significant recognition of some of those sort of, I guess, planning arguments that were happening between these new resi developments and particularly like really beloved music venues, clubs. Do you think that it will be useful if more councils kind of adopted a local approach that's clear, or do you think that what you've got to work with at the moment outside of, I'm thinking outside of London, do you think that that gives you enough to go on, and it's really is a case by case basis? Or
having a consistent approach makes life easier for everyone. So I mean, you can always argue about what that should be. But having something that can be applied consistently would make a lot of sense. It helps both parties. It helps the local authorities in determining the acceptability of any impact, and it helps the developer in terms of understanding what it is that they're trying to achieve, I think. I mean, otherwise you get into these grey areas, and I mean, whenever there's a grey area, there's room to exploit it, essentially, and so there's scope for problems to happen further down the line.
Sure, that makes sense, and I'm sure, yeah, as with everything planning, there's always different shades of grey, I guess.
Yeah, well, I mean, and this is it, and
yeah.
in practice, I mean, the planning is. Noise is just one aspect of the considerations of the planning application, isn't it? There's a balance that needs to be struck between the various positives and negatives. But if you have something that allows you to quantify the noise impact, then you can weigh that more appropriately against the potential positives from a development.
Yeah, that makes complete sense, and I guess then you're at less risk of ending up in protracted arguments or being challenged, as you were saying. So I guess if you're taking a step back and you're advising a client on the site, or someone's come to you for pre-app if you're at an LPA, what are the kind of the key things that you'd think about trying to dig up at pre-app stage to make sure that you're all on the same page with what, you know, the noise and amenity considerations are?
Yeah, well, so the first thing is, are there any explicit requirements from the local authority? So is it clear what you need to achieve? And then there is also the consideration of what are the client aspirations for the site as well. So you need to satisfy the planners as to the impact will be acceptable. But ultimately, if you're going to sell or let these residential units, if that's what it is, then you don't want complaints coming further down the line. So how amenable are you to that? How much do you care about that? And then the other aspect is, so some of it is it's sort of the feasibility considerations. How loud is it, and how much space is there to mitigate the noise? So as well as cost associated with putting all this mitigation in place, it all takes up space. You end up with very deep walls, you end up with very thick glazing, and then it's a cost in itself, but you end up with lettable space in the development, and it can really start to affect your feasibility. So it's, can you make sufficient allowance? Can you get the areas that you need in the building to make it feasible to build? So yeah, I think those are the main issues.
Sure. I guess you touched on bits around PD, and I guess one of the things that, I mean, everyone's going to kind of be wondering about really is that with this new kind of town centre use class E, and the ability to switch between what we know as kind of retail and switching between office, light industrial, some leisure uses, some community uses, without actually even applying for a change of use. What do you think of the potential conflicts that I guess will arise that we as sort of planners need to be aware of that might not happen now in the planning process, but it might affect our clients later on in licensing or actually operating what they've developed?
So would you need permission to become Class E in the first place, or?
No, so I think that, having read it in complete detail, but I think my understanding is that there'll be a transitional period for the next year, and then from then on it's just saying, well, I'm a retail type use, or I'm currently a gym use, and I want to, and I consider myself to be X use, which now falls within Class E, so you don't need permission anymore. So, for example, you're not going to be thinking of, oh, I want to change from a shop to a cafe. What are the noise issues? What conditions am I going to get faced with? But somewhere, probably licensing, for example, that's where that's going to come in.
Okay.
Do you think that?
Well, I mean, it sounds like a bit of a nightmare, to be honest with you. I mean, there's two aspects. So if there's no planning process, where is the control of the noise from the plant and machinery? So if you change to a restaurant, you need a kitchen extract fan, you might need cooling plant on the roof, which is going to make noise. The impact of that is currently controlled through planning condition. The noise from the plant should be no more than X dB below the background noise level of the nearest noise sensitive receiver. So if there's no control of that, you've potentially got a worsening of the noise, just general noise environment everywhere, but particularly noise sensitive receivers. And then if you can go from a relatively benign and quiet use to something which is loud, a sort of A4, currently A4, so bars, or a noisy restaurant use, you can have quite significant noise impacts on your neighbours. And even if, I mean, licensing could limit the level of music, I guess, that you're allowed to play, and it could limit your hours of operation. But I mean, could it prevent you from doing it at all? I mean, I mean, you can still, if you fill a room full of people, they can make a lot of noise, and that can start to impact on your neighbours, sort of regardless of how much music you can do, and regardless of what time of day it is. And with the current slightly bizarre circumstances that have led to this, everyone's working at home now as well, so everyone's at home to be annoyed by by their neighbours, when perhaps during the day they wouldn't care so much because they wouldn't be there. I think there's probably quite a few noise problems, and I'm sure there are other problems stored up in that.
So not all will be simple then. I think you kind of gave an insight into sort of, I guess, how the world of PD might not be as simple as well, you know, when you're looking at flipping offices to resi, and how inevitably it will impinge on the other new PD rights that are coming into play with demolition and rebuilding, with upward extension. I guess, unless anybody's got any kind of further questions to sort of wrap it up, if you're working on a mixed-use site and you're right at right at the beginning of the project, and nobody's really started doing any proper assessment yet, are there any sort of design red flags that you'd, I guess, just sort of recommend people bear in mind when you're on a project planning, or when you're reviewing a project?
Yeah, well, so a lot I touched on sort of building like floating boxes and these sorts of like very high performance specialist acoustic things. The thing you want to avoid having to do any of that kind of stuff, and some of it is just down to sensible space planning and controlling your adjacencies. You don't want to put noisy spaces next to quiet spaces. It seems like a statement of the obvious, but it perhaps isn't always, or there can be an assumption that you can just deal with it. So you should seek to avoid that as far as possible. I mean, mixed use is very popular now, and there are benefits to it. It's sort of self-policing. If there are residents there, it sort of controls other impacts and things like that. But so avoiding, you can use buffer spaces, circulation spaces, so separate off your noisy uses from the residential that's above it. Residential are sort of a more benign commercial use. My boss is from New York, and their standard approach in New York is you have noisy retail on the ground floor. You have some offices above that, which are less sensitive to the retail on the ground floor and less noisy themselves. Then you have the residential sitting above that. So something like that would work very well. The other thing is having, it's more difficult. You can do more in terms of the horizontal planning and put corridors and things around it. Vertically, unless you're going to put some other kind of benign use in there like an office, you just need to make sure that you've got a zone in that, so you've got scope to put in a ceiling and have some kind of floor there. But then the other thing, the less obvious thing, is perhaps your flanking transmission. So if you have a glass building, you've got a lightweight facade, there is as well as the path through the floor, there's a path around the floor via the window by the lightweight facade, and so that can start to limit what you can do. So when you put in your planning application and you say this is what the building is going to look like, you've limited yourself perhaps in what you can do. That if you've just got an architectural dream of sort of lots of glazing, sort of, you know, like a single line separating the two, it will look great, but you might have caused yourself a big problem in terms of actually achieving a sensible level of separation.
Great. Well, yeah, it was certainly provided all of us with food for thought, I'm sure. And I've seen that, yeah, you put your contact details there. So, I mean, I don't know if I'm dangerous to say it, but if anybody's got any, I guess, burning questions that they haven't asked today, if they're free to get in touch with you. Bob, thanks very much for your time today. That was a brilliant overview. And yeah, I mean, as I said, everyone, this is sort of part of an Ask an Expert series. So today we've had acoustics, previously we've had development viability and ground contamination, and we'll certainly be looking at more topics in due course, so keep your eyes peeled. But otherwise, enjoy your evening. Thank you.
Thank you.